Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Senate Budget and Tax Committee. Big day today. Today we report out all the work from the subcommittees, and then we will be in a voting session later, and we will pass the budget. I'm going to ask, before we begin on all that, though, David Romans and Steve McCullough to brief us on supplemental budget number 4.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to share a screen so you can see our document. Is that large enough for everybody? Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, so supplemental 4 came in this week. It is probably not the last supplemental. I would expect you'll see at least 1 or 2 more. It has a mixture of general funds, transportation funds, as well as some federal stimulus from December dollars. The first section are sort of the miscellaneous general fund items. There's $7.4 million for in the Board of Public Works budget, but it's really to demolish the Baltimore City Community College's Bard building. This building has been a longstanding issue for the college and trying to figure out what to do with it. So they're going to knock the building down. The next couple of items there, $4.9 million in the Comptroller's office. In the Relief Act, you authorize stimulus payments of about $178 million to people who received the EITC in 2019. The Comptroller's office believes that the amount of money provided is a little bit short, so this $4.9 million should give them enough to make sure they can make all of the payments to eligible individuals. The next item is an unusual item. It's $8.7 million of general funds going into the Department of Transportation budget for a grant to Prince George's County for Blue Line corridor projects. What's unusual about this is, to the best of my knowledge, in no time in at least the last 30 years has the state ever put general funds into the MDOT budget. So it's a very strange approach to budgeting, and we're not really sure why they did it that way. We aren't really objecting to the specifics of what they want to spend the money on, but it seems like it either should have been funded with Transportation Trust Fund dollars or some sort of general fund grant, not in the trust fund. The next 3 items are all related to the State Department of Education. The Office of the Inspector General gets about almost $900,000 and 6 new positions to bolster the operations. There's a grant to the Literacy Lab Leading Men Fellowship Program, which is a program that tries to get young African-American men involved in early childhood education. And then the last item is over $1 million for the Interagency Committee on School Construction. This includes 14 positions, 4 to help do the assessments of what the school needs are, what condition the various schools are in, and 10 people to help manage construction operations, which are obviously expanding under the Built to Learn Act. The next section in the document focuses on transportation. There's a lot of activity here, and we're going to let Steve McCullough, our transportation expert, talk to you about that.
There's a lot of puts and takes going on in supplemental number 4 with regards to transportation. But in a general sense, if you look at the total column for the federal funds, Supplemental 4 brings in $233 million of the federal stimulus funds into the MDOT budget. They are bringing it into the operating side of the budget, and there are corresponding decreases for much of that, as you can see on the 3rd line, with 150 million coming in and 146 going out. What that does is frees up money and increases the bonding capacity that MDOT has, and they, in this supplemental, plan to issue an additional $200 million in bonds in fiscal 2022 to support the capital program. And you can see that in this middle line, the $404 million coming in for just various construction projects. Generally speaking, there's about $100 million that comes in capital for 2021, the current year, just to cover cash flow for existing projects in MTA and State Highway Administration. In fiscal 2022, the funds are used in the MTA for state of good repair. There's $150 million. That provision is contingent on a BRFA provision that would reduce the MTA operating mandate in fiscal 2022 by $38 million. In State Highway in fiscal 2022, there's $100 million for projects that include resurfacing, drainage, bridge work, and traffic management. So these are all, again, types of state of good repair. The port gets $22 million in fiscal 2022 for dredged material containment facility and for environmental compliance work. There's a $15 million going to the airport for parking garage guidance system. There are $7 million for IT upgrades for MVA to assist in the current new environment of doing things more remotely. And there's also $6 million in the state, in the Secretary's office for IT support for department-wide for this new way of doing things. So at the bottom, you can see there's $62 million that comes in for MTA for their operating budget. And this then makes the budget comply with the mandate for fiscal 2022. Of that $62 million, however, there's amendments at the back of the supplemental 4, which make reductions of $38 million to the base budget, the special fund budget for operations. And that is basically what MDOT has talked out with the Chairman McRae and his counterpart on the House side to bring in the money, reduce it by the $38 million, and also increase the funding for MTA on the capital side by that $150 million. So basically, in essence, that's kind of what's going on.
Okay, the next section is back to general funds. There's a total of $25 million in general funds for higher education, split among Morgan State, St. Mary's College, and the university system, with the university system getting, as you can see, $23.4 million of that. They're using the money for different purposes. At Morgan, it's for on-campus safety enhancements. At St. Mary's, it's for additional operating support. And for the university system of Maryland, they're upgrading at almost every institution public health related programs, for example, nursing programs and so forth. So making some enhancements to those kind of workforce in the public health world programs. There's also a lot of federal funds coming in across all of higher ed, about $227 million. Again, with the bulk of that, $167 million going to USM, Morgan getting 50, and actually Baltimore City Community College gets nearly 7 million. This is all related to the December federal stimulus money that went to higher education schools and bringing that money in. The final substantive piece here is in housing. Again, this is federal stimulus from December, $258 million for emergency rental assistance. As I understand it, the money is going to be used per a work group of legislative and executive branch representatives to try to work out the best uses of those funds. So all told, the supplemental is a little over $1 billion, about 49 million of new general fund spending, 259 million of special funds, and over 700 million of federal dollars. As I said, I expect you will see more supplementals before we are done, especially around federal funds, as there still are a lot of federal funds out there. Mr. Chairman, we're happy to answer any questions you have. I would note the House made no amendments on the floor to the budget or BRFA related to this supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Romans. Questions from the committee? Okay. Seeing none. Oh, wait. Senator King.
Can we go back to the thing where they talk about Cade?
Oh, I don't even need to. Yeah, so on Cade, there was language in the operating budget for the Cade formula that made a contingent reduction that said if the BRFA passes, the Cade formula money is reduced by something like $27 million. The administration is striking that language out of the budget bill. So whatever happens in the BRFA, it wouldn't reduce the appropriation. The House has already rejected that BRFA provision, so that there was going to be no cut in terms of what they've done in the budget
Okay.
to the CADE formula.
Okay, thank you.
So on that point, does that free up? Well, but that certainly changes our bottom line, doesn't it? But we have to even do that, or
You would still want to reject the BRFA still has that. Well, the House has rejected the BRFA item. So right now, there's nothing in the BRFA related to CADE. I think if you don't want to cut community colleges, you just want to agree with the House and keep it out of the BRFA, and then you're all set.
Okay.
all right, Senator McCray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Romans, you gave an example in reference to USM of how the monies could be used, and you gave one specific example if they wanted to do public health enhancements. You said like nursing programs. Did you get like one or two so that I can make sure I'm on the same page with you?
There are multiple schools. I think 9 different institutions are getting money. Some of them put them into other public health professions. Not every school even has a nursing program, but the bulk of it, I believe, goes to nursing and a variety of other programs. Each school kind of chose whatever public health workforce programs they wanted to focus on.
Okay, public health workforce. I got it. Thank you.
Senator Alfrith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. David, along the same lines as Senator King's question about community colleges, are we, because it wasn't included in the supplemental, does that mean there was no funding that went, federal funding from the December CARES that went to community colleges, or is the governor kind of by striking the language in the BRFA on community colleges for CADE, is it kind of fun math here?
And so the federal stimulus money, there is quite a bit of money that goes to community colleges. That money will go directly to the community colleges. It will not pass through the state budget.
Okay, thank you very much.
Senator Zucker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. David, thank you. So in terms of, it looks like 77 million was I guess you could say restored to the university system in Maryland from the Board of Public Works cut, if you will, from this past July. So where does that lead? I think they were cut by like, what, 170 million in July?
That sounds right. I don't have the number at the.
Okay, then I have my answer. So if they were cut by 170 million roughly, this restores about 77 million of that, so still 100 million that they were cut from the Board of Public Works in July that hasn't been restored yet, it sounds like.
Well, it restores 25 million of state funds.
Got it. But it's backfilled by federal funds, right?
Right.
Yep. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Mr.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, let's get down to the fun. Let's hear from those subcommittees. First up is Health and Human Services.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the Senate Budget and Tax Committee. I'm pleased to provide the report from the Subcommittee on Health and Human Services. First of all, I would like to thank the members of the subcommittee, and they are Senator Addie Eckert, Senator Jim Rosapep, and our new member this year, Senator Ronald Young. We also want to thank our committee staff, Philip Anthony, and the budget analysts, who are Andrew Garrison, Emily Haskell, Nicholas Konzelman, Grace Pedersen, Simon Powell, Samuel Quist, Ann Wagner, and Tanya Zimmerman. I'd also like to thank Madeline Ross, who edited this report. And colleagues, as you know, our subcommittee, as yours did, met virtually with our colleagues from the House side. And so the subcommittee therefore had the benefit of hearing our colleagues from the House, their questions and concerns, and they heard ours. So the subcommittee report will include the modifications that we've made to the House actions. On pages 3 and 6 of your document, the subcommittee postponed the due dates for a report in the executive department, boards and commissions and offices, and for a report in the Department of Aging. Also in the Department of Aging, on pages 8 and 9, the subcommittee adopted language restricting some federal funds to be used at the discretion of the Area on Aging agencies. Starting on page 11, in the military department, the subcommittee adopted language expressing intent that MEMA convene a task force to counter domestic terrorism and restricted federal funds to be used as recommended by that task force. On page 14, in the Maryland Institute for Emergency Medical Service Systems, the subcommittee added language requesting a report on the state's public health emergency response and preparedness. Beginning on page 16 and continuing on to page 17, in the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting information on high deductible plans and perceived consumer knowledge of cost sharing obligation and service utilization. On page 20, in the Maryland Department of Health Administration, the subcommittee reduced the amount restricted pending a report on mass vaccination site in Montgomery County. On pages 22 and 23, in the Health Professional Boards and Commissions, the subcommittee added two pieces of narrative. The first on the fee structure for the Board of Counselors and Therapists, and the second on the workload and staffing adequacy of the Board of Nursing. On pages 25 through 29, the Prevention and Health Promotion Administration, the subcommittee added two pieces of language related to equity and access in the COVID-19 vaccine distribution, including restricting funds pending two reports. On pages 33 through 34, in the Behavioral Health Administration, the subcommittee struck a contingent reduction and added two pieces of narrative. One on the new Greater Baltimore Regional Integrated Crisis System, and the other on the implementation of the new federal suicide hotline. In the Developmental Disabilities Administration, on pages 35 through 40, the subcommittee modified language adopted by the House to add an information request related to the LTSS transition. We also added language regarding enhanced Medicaid matching fund for home and community-based services and restricted funds pending a report. And we adopted narrative to service placements for transitioning youth. Starting on page 41 in Medicaid, the subcommittee added language regarding the enhanced federal matching funds for home and community-based services and restricted funds pending a report. The subcommittee applied similar language to Medicaid behavioral health provider reimbursements on page 46. On page 49, in the Health Regulatory Commission, the subcommittee added narrative on the hospital at home model of care, and on page 50, struck language pertaining to a contingent reduction. On page 58, in the Department of Human Social Services Administration, the subcommittee partially restored a deficiency appropriation for foster care maintenance payments. On page 72, in the Department of Housing and Community Development, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on broadband availability. On page 75, in the Family Investment Administration, the subcommittee modified a section adopted by the House to clarify the lead author on a joint report. Now moving to the BRFA actions on pages 78 and 79. In the Maryland Department of Health, the Senate rejected DLS 8 alt and adopted Senate 8 alt to fully fund the Community Health Resource Commission at $8 million and provide a funding source to fully support the Senior Prescription Drug Assistance Program in fiscal 22, as well as secure an immediate out-year funding for both programs. In the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange, in item 9, technical, the subcommittee added an additional technical amendment to expand the authorized uses of the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange Fund to include Medicaid for fiscal 2021 and 2022 consistent with the committee's actions on item 9. In health professional boards, the subcommittee reduced the amount authorized for transfer from the Board of Counselors and Therapists by $500,000 in item 27. We decreased the amount of authorized transfer from the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission by $1 million in item 28. We also rejected a provision authorizing a $700,000 transfer from the Board of Psychologists in 101 DLS additional. Mr. Chairman, that concludes the subcommittee's report. So I don't know if I make a motion or take questions, whatever
Let's
you're.
take questions if there are any.
Okay.
How about why can you just take a minute and explain those actions that relate to the Community Health Resources Commission and Care First and the Senior Drug Prescription Program?
Certainly. So as many of you know, there have been 2 programs that have been funded out of the Care First fees that are collected each year. We've taken care of our Community Health Resource Commission, which was established by the legislature, and they are to be funded at $8 million a year. And we have the Senior Prescription Drug Program, which is funded at an amount that has changed from year to year, but is usually somewhere around $11 million. The cost for prescription drug subsidies has gone up. So this year, the subcommittee made modifications so that the Community Health Resource Commission would receive most of its funding from the fund where it has previously been funded, but would receive the remainder from the reinsurance fund. And the Senior Prescription Drug Program would also be fully funded from its traditional source. In the out years, we have taken action that would ensure that both programs are fully funded by making sure the Community Health Resource Commission would be funded through the reinsurance fund, and the Senior Prescription Drug Program would continue to be funded from the Care First fees.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Okay, awesome job. Thank you, subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next up, Public Safety, Transportation, and the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the committee. First, I'm just proud to stay here today and just want to also thank my subcommittee members, starting in alphabetical order, Senator George Edwards, Senator Doug Peters, and Senator Johnny Ray Sailing. I would also like to thank our committee staff, Matt Bennett, our support staff, Greg Ogden, who edited this document. And also I would like to add in there Mr. Will Elder, who helped us navigate this Zoom operation to the best of our ability. Finally, start to recognize some of our friends from DLS who helped make this possible. If I could start with Nicholas Konzelman, who I called on a lot in reference to a number of questions or just being able to navigate the subcommittee. And I just wanted to say thank you. And also like to say thank you to Jacob Cash, Andrew Garrison, Andrew Gray, Emily Haskell, Jason Kramer, Steve McCulloch, Madeline Miller, Samuel Quist, Caleb Weiss, and Tanya Zimmerman. And as we begin the report, I would ask everyone to turn and begin on page 1 with the judiciary, where the subcommittee struck language related to salary increases consistent with the legislative intent. On page 2, the subcommittee reduced funding for capital improvement projects. If you turn to page 4, the subcommittee also adopted committee narrative requesting a report on specialty treatment court recidivism. On page 6, in the Office of Attorney General, the subcommittee increased the turnover rate for 1 new position to 25% and reduced general funding accordingly. The subcommittee also adopted narrative requesting a report on the non-budgeted special fund balances that the agency maintains. If we turn to page 7 through 9, in the Public Service Commission, the subcommittee reduced funds to reflect a higher turnover expectancy based on recent experience and adopted 3 pieces of narrative to request information on the progress in installing electric vehicle charging stations under a pilot program, comparison of the regulation of energy suppliers, and notification of the posting of utility complaint data. On page 12, where we start with Merlin Energy Administration, the subcommittee struck language restricting the use of a portion of the Merlin Gas Expansion Fund for energy assistance. On page 14, the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services, the subcommittee adopted language directing funds to the Boys and Girls Clubs. Also on page 14, and in continuing to page 18, the subcommittee modified language pertaining to the Victims of Crime Act funding to clarify the definition of state and non-state providers. On page 20, the subcommittee adopted narrative expressing committee intent that funding to local management boards and Youth Services Bureau be restored to the fiscal 2021 legislative appropriation. On page 21, going to the Department of Planning, the subcommittee restricted funding until a tax credit reviewer is converted to a regular position and a staffing report is submitted. On page 22, in the Department of Veteran Affairs, the subcommittee added narrative on complementary alternative medicine for veterans. And on page 23, starting with Merlin Automobile Insurance Fund, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on legislation changing the installment payment plan. On page 24, in the Comptroller of Merlin, the subcommittee modified a House action to increase turnover and reduce general funds accordingly. On page 26, now we're at the State Lottery and Gaming and Control Agency. The subcommittee modified the amount of the House reduction for lottery advertising and adopted narrative on minority business enterprise participation in lottery advertising. We will now turn to the Maryland Department of Transportation, what we know as MDOT. In MDOT debt service requirements, on page 33, the subcommittee would like to amend the report to modify the language adopted by the House to increase the debt limit by $200 million to $3.676 billion. In the State Highway Administration, on page 36, the subcommittee modified language added by the House on suicide barriers on bridges and restricted funds to be used only for the Southern Merlin Rapid Transit Project. Some of us know it's SMRT project, contingent on receipt of a federal grant for the project. On page 39, in the Motor Vehicle Administration, MVA, the subcommittee adopted language restricting funds pending a report on changes to the Vehicle Emissions Inspection Program. On pages 41 and 42, in the MTA, Maryland Transit Administration, the subcommittee added 2 pieces of language restricting funds pending reports on expanding bus service to Trade Point Atlantic and on adding Mark Station in East Baltimore. The subcommittee also adopted narrative, also on page 42, expressing the intent that the Maryland Transit Administration include a study of the feasibility of extending MARC service to Western Maryland in a statewide transit plan currently under development. On page 43, the Maryland Aviation Administration, the subcommittee adopted requesting a report on aircraft noise mitigation at BWI Airport. And on page 44 through 47, the Department of Natural Resources, the subcommittee reduced the funding restricted by the House for a coal combustion byproducts report and adopted 3 pieces of narrative on the following topics: a coyote population study, Patapsco Valley State Park access, and on oyster lease locations. We will now turn to the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. On page 49, the subcommittee adopted language requesting a report on audited COVID-19 inmate medical expenses. If you look on page 51 and 53, the subcommittee reversed 2 actions that would have maintained operations on the Eastern and Southern Merlin pre-release units. Also on page 53 and on page 54, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting reports on the reentry programs and local pre-release cooperation. On page 56 and on page 57, the subcommittee adopted language to restricting funds pending a report on probation and parole supervisees and increased turnover to align with current vacancies. In the Police and Correctional Training Commissions, PCTC, on page 58, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on dementia training for law enforcement. On page 60, the subcommittee rejected language that would have restricted funds pending the report on substance use disorder services. On page 61 and 62, Merlin Department of Environment, the subcommittee restricted funds until the submission of Groundwater Protection Program update report. The subcommittee also restricted funds until the submission of a report on PFAS chemicals. On page 65 and continuing on page 66, the subcommittee adopted narrative on procurement procedures and rate setting for the Merlin Environmental Services. We'll now turn our attention to the Department of State Police. Starting on page 68 and 69, the subcommittee restricted funding until the submission of a departmental action plan to improve diversity. The subcommittee also adopted narrative requesting information on state police operation in Baltimore City on page 70 and the Vehicle Theft Prevention Fund on page 71. Also on page 71, the subcommittee increased the turnover expectancy for new positions. On page 78, in the Uninsured Employers Fund, the committee modified the funding restriction on a report on the structure of state workers' compensation related agencies. The subcommittee would like to amend the report to reject section 47 on page 80 and 81, which was added by the House. On page 81 and 82, the subcommittee adopted back of the bill language restricting funds on agencies with repeat cybersecurity audit findings. Finally, we will turn to the subcommittee's related to the BRFA on page 83. Provision 1 pertains to the Office of the Attorney General, was modified from a $700,000 contingent reduction, a $350,000 contingent reduction. The subcommittee rejected the House transfers of $1 million from the Charlotte Halls Veteran Home Special Fund to General Funds and Provision 105-DLS additional. The subcommittee adopted BRFA Provision 34 related to the 2 closures of the 2 pre-release units in the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. Finally, the subcommittee would like to add a provision to the BRFA to reduce the level of funding required to be included in the fiscal 2022 budget for the MTA operations. Mr. Chair, that concludes the report on the fiscal 2022 budget for Public Safety, Transportation, and Environment PSTE Subcommittee. Thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. Senator McCray. I've received information that the subcommittee may wish to consider the coal combustion byproduct language on pages 45 and 46 of the report?
The subcommittee would like to remove its actions reduced under funding restriction and instead reject the House language and adopt committee narrative. And Matt, if you could just show that to us. You're on mute.
On mute. You're on mute, Matt.
How does that look? Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right. Does everybody agree?
Yes, sir.
We'd like to adopt that language. Is there a second? I think this was a second by Senator Harris.
Second. Yep.
All right. Very good.
Mr. Chair, that now concludes report for PSTE.
So, Mr. Bennett, I know we've got another, are we doing some extra color sheets in when we get to the full committee?
Yes, that's going to be later on.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Eckert?
Thank you very much. A couple of questions on page 27. Mr. Subcommittee Chair, on that, I think it was that page, it was one of those that expanded our bonding authority or amount. Is that reasonable? It just sounded like a lot. Just somebody explain a little bit more why we did such a big jump on the bonds. It's on page 33. I apologize. Matt or anybody?
I apologize. Matt was actually running over to talk to me about another matter, so he may need to hop back on and hear that again. I apologize. But
it just says.
I think we've got Steve. Steve, did you want to?
Oh yeah, there you go.
Yep.
Yes, that provision relates to supplemental number 4, that the state, that the administration is bringing in additional capital. Every year you have to, by statute, adopt a level for what they're going to issue.
Right.
It's usually just set at what they plan to issue. Because of the circumstances, they had it at 1 level. With the supplemental, they can increase it by 2. That's all that's doing.
Okay, are there any, and there's no, I mean, that's not going to be an issue further out with additional needs or indebtedness?
With the revenue write-downs, the amount of bonds that they had planned to issue has been scaled back. So with the recovery, that should, increase back to where it is. But even with this $200 million increase, it's lower than where they were expected to be over the next 6 years in last year's program.
Okay, that's great. And then I had one more question, if that's all right, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely.
On page 5, I've just had a lot of concerns that I'm hearing about regarding court reporters, and apparently there's been this staffing study or work study, and it has to do, I think, with the public defender study. Was there any discussion in the committee or feedback from advocates about the court reporters? There seems to be an issue with them and the public defenders and who's working for who. And I didn't know if we needed to add some language to get clarification on the role of the court reporters. How they're paid and who they do. Okay, I'm just double checking because it came to me and I was just curious. Since there was an item on here, it kind of, your red flags went off.
Got it.
Okay.
I get Okay, thank
Very
you.
good. Any other questions? Okay, let's move on to education.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to present the Education Business Administration's report of our budget decisions. First, let me thank just the fantastic colleagues who I serve with on the subcommittee in alphabetical order: Paul Quarterman, Senator Sarah Elfreth, and Senator Nancy King. Also, I'll never forget the indispensable Erica Schisler. So Erica, thank you for all your help. And also wanted to thank the other budget analysts, Sarah Baker, Patrick Frank, Andrew Gray, Emily Haskell, Laura Hyde, Ian Klein, Nicholas Konzelman, Steve McCullough, Samuel Quist, Rebecca Ruff, Ann Wagner, and of course, Diksha Walia, who helped edit this document. So colleagues, if you kindly turn to page 2, we'll begin with the Maryland Stadium Authority. The subcommittee adopted narrative requesting an update on the Hagerstown multi-use sports and event facility. Again, a big shout out to Senator Quarterman for his advocacy on this topic. Turning to page 3 for the Department of Information Technology, the subcommittee added language expressing the intent to place pictures of secretaries and deputy secretaries on the department's website and restricting funds pending report on the website of the principal department. Turning to page 4, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on information technology, debt, and enterprise sharing services for IT support. And I remind the committee that we're just going through those items that we have differences with the House. Now turning to the Department of General Services, which you can find on page 6 and 7. The subcommittee adopted 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports on greenhouse gas reduction goals and personal protective equipment stockpiles and readiness. Now turning your attention to page 8, which is the Department of Labor. The subcommittee adopted 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports on unemployment insurance implementation staffing, which I'd like to modify. So Ms. Schisler, if you can. So we just want to modify to add additional information on processing of unemployment claims. So we've just added some more bullet points for that. And what I thought I'd do is just go through some of the changes so we can put that on hold. I'll continue through, and then I would move just to adopt the additional changes. So we also adopted narrative projects affected by the Power Apprenticeship Act. And Senator McRae has been doing a great job on that. And that was from legislation that was passed before. So this has become somewhat of annual language. And at the bottom of the page, continuing on to page 9, the subcommittee modified language to restrict funds to help the autism waiver program. And upon further consideration, we've also like to restrict funds to assist the Montgomery County Agricultural Center. So Ms. Schisler, if you wouldn't mind putting that up too. So colleagues, just to sort of walk you through this. So there's an unemployment insurance fund. This was to pay the interest. Department of Legislative Services had found $15 million that the department didn't need to spend right now. So what we did was the subcommittee has already taken action on items 1 and 2. Those have already been adopted. The item number 3 is what is for your consideration. It was, and I want to thank Senator King for her advocacy on this as well. This would go to the Montgomery County Agricultural Center to support their stormwater fees and operating costs. It would be $76,000 that we would restrict from this fund to go assist the Montgomery County Agricultural Center. And if you see uncodified language below in the explanation, it also says that we'd really like, it's the intent of the committees that the governor would generously also provide in the FY23 budget, $76,000 as well. So we're going to wait on this as well, and we'll try to move all 3 at the same time. In addition, we'd also like to add restricting language of funds for the Department of Labor pending a report on changes they would be making on the beacon system to make sure that it's more accessible to users. As I know Senator Elfreth and others have been working tirelessly on this, but there's been issues with their app. We look forward to working in partnership with the Department of Labor, but we would like to get an update on how things are progressing. So with that, I'd like to entertain a motion on basically taking those three updates to be adopted. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second. Senator Eckert has a question.
Yes, tell me again what fund this is from.
Sure. So it's a repayment. It would be based on interest repayment for interest that we got for the unemployment insurance fund. We need to make that payment this year. So it's actually $15 million that isn't going to be needed to pay back the interest. So what we've done is we fenced some of that money off to fund some of our priorities. If the governor decides not to use the fence off money, then it would go back to the general fund.
Okay, well, maybe I'll need an offline conversation, and it would seem to me if it was related to unemployment with all the issues we'd have, it might get turned back into some of.
It has nothing to do with the actual unemployment claims. It would just be what we'd be paying on the interest of the claims, and it would go directly back into the general fund anyway. It doesn't go back into it doesn't go to the unemployment.
Doesn't, I was just trying to get the nexus of it, you know. I mean, we seem to be having one thing and thank you.
Yeah. So now we'll turn our attention to page 10 for the State Department of Education headquarters. The subcommittee added language restricting funds pending report on the Maryland School for the Deaf. If you'll turn your attention to page 15 for the Maryland State Department of Education, Aid to Education, the subcommittee added language restricting funds to provide a grant to assist the adult high school pilot program. On pages 16 to 18, the subcommittee adopted two pieces of narrative requesting reports on the autism waiver program and the compensation framework for non-public special education teachers. On page 20, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting report on the community eligibility provision. And on page 26 for the Maryland State Department of Education funding for educational organizations, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a study on dual enrollment. For the Maryland Longitudinal Data Systems Center on page 31, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting report on dual enrollment. For Bowie State University on page 36, the subcommittee added language restricting funds to be used for the Center for Law, Social Justice, and Civic Engagement. Continuing on to the University System of Maryland office on page 37, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting report on contracting services. On pages 40 and 41 for the Maryland Higher Education Commission, the subcommittee adopted two pieces of narrative requesting reports on the Maryland Loan Assistance Repayment Program for foster care recipients and the Collegium. On page 43 for the state support for the higher education institutions, the item is technical and reflects the action previously taken by the subcommittee. Continuing on to the Department of Commerce on page 47, the subcommittee added language restricting funds pending a report on funding that was provided to Lockheed Martin. If the committee will now turn to page 49 regarding the Maryland Economic Development Corporation, the committee adopted narrative requesting a report on the resolution of student house lease cancellations. This, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, concludes the subcommittee's actions on the operating budget. We'll now turn to our actions on the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, known as BRFA. So moving to the subcommittee's actions on BRFA on page 52, the subcommittee rejected the House adoption of item 6, which would have repealed the mandate for the Maryland Loan Assistance Repayment Program for foster care recipients. I'd also like to make mention, make note of, even though it was something we agreed with the House, I know it's a hot issue. The subcommittee restored all money regarding community colleges when it came to the CADE formula, as well as the independent colleges, which we know is Sellinger, that provides aid and scholarships to low-income families. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and that concludes the entire report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Questions? Senator Eckert.
Sorry. Thank you. Where's Boost?
So that's a good question. So Boost. So the committee adopted the annual narrative when it comes to the civil rights and other language that we adopt annually. The Boost funding will be taken up by full committee.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Senator Peters.
Last but not
Capital
least,
Pago.
Mr. Chair, the Capital Budget Subcommittee. I'd like to thank the members of the subcommittee, the Vice Chair, Senator Zucker, our newest member, Senator Eckert, our most senior member, Senator Edwards, Senator Griffith, Senator King, and Senator McCrae. And of course, our committee staff, Philip Anthony, Matthew Bennett, and Erica Schisler. And our analysts, Sarah Baker, Jacob Cash, Emily Haskell, Andrew Gray, Ian Klein, and Samuel Quist, and Kate Lee Cannon, who edited this document. On page 1, Mr. Chair, the Department of Natural Resources, the subcommittee restricted program open space funding for a county until a letter submitted confirming that steps are being taken for a project. On page 2, the subcommittee restricted the amount of bay restoration funding for a project to no more than half of the total projected cost. And we were very agreeable with the House because we concurred on the Bertha. And that concludes the subcommittee's report.
Senator, what have you been doing all session?
This small document will be miniature compared to the very large document that will have what are called local bond initiatives. Very controversial in terms of I said this, you said that, and I got that. So that's coming, Mr. Chairman.
Very
You did a
good.
great job anyway, Senator Peters.
Yeah, everything's looking good. Thank you. Any questions for the senator? All right, very good. So that concludes the presentations from the subcommittees. We're going to now head over to the committee room and do some voting. All right, see you in a minute.